already in the opening days of the French Revolution. One of their heroes was the Marquis de Sade. And the Marquis de Sade, the term sadism comes from the Marquis de Sade, just to say that much.
And who is the Marquis de Sade? Just real
And
quick, just to.
the Marquis de Sade was a novelist and a pornographer, basically, in the 18th century. And he was in the opening days of the French Revolution. He was in jail. He was in the Bastille, going up to, I think, July 12th, 1789, in Paris. He was in the Bastille because he had murdered a prostitute, doing inappropriate things with a prostitute. And probably isn't the only person he murdered. But he was also a kind of quasi-hero of at least some French revolutionaries in the opening in June and July of 1789. And they thought that he was actually on the crowds around the Bastille in the opening days of July 1789. They were gathering. The Marquis de Sade was in the Bastille. He was using whatever instruments he could from his cell to scream out the window to try to rile up the crowds. And most likely on July 12th or 13th, he was removed from the Bastille and taken to another prison. But when they stormed the Bastille, the first room the revolutionaries ran into was what they thought was the cell of the Marquis de Sade, right? Because he was one of their heroes. And I just take that as like a focal point, right? He was interested in undoing the family. He was interested in what I would call subversive, a democracy. He understood democracy, a kind of democracy, as being subversive of the family, subversive moral values, of healthy moral values. And obviously there was no communism at that point, right? Because communism isn't really born until 1848. But you can see there are these powerful movements, intellectual, cultural, for undermining the family, undermining moral values, coming out of I don't want to say the entire French Revolution was this way, but certainly there was a strong element of it among the French revolutionaries. Sigmund Freud was this way, right? Sigmund Freud, essentially, you could take his understanding of the ego, the id, the ego, and the superego, and he's kind of mapping onto the classical understanding of the human soul as being the passions, the will, and the intellect. And let's just face it, a lot of Freudian psychotherapy was to, as he himself said, we're going to undo what the Catholic priests used to do in the confessional, and we'll get paid for it, right? Wow. And a lot of Freudian psychotherapy was intended to come up with a way of using classical morality. It would be just to free the passions, and to give some sort of a sanction to the freedom of the passions over the will and the intellect. And those who were interested in subverting morality, subverting the family, many of them became Freudian psychoanalysts. And they actually, if you want to dig into this a little bit more, they really saw, Freud saw that especially going through women were the protectors of culture. Women were the protectors of morality. And a psychoanalyst could, one by one, if he could, through his clients, basically help bring about the undermining of a healthy Christian culture. But I would also say just a healthy culture, a healthy moral culture. One particular disciple of Sigmund Freud was Wilhelm Reich. And Wilhelm Reich was he was a Freudian psychoanalyst in the 1930s. He was committed to this model of, well, how do we undermine Catholic morality? How do we undermine the family? How do we undermine morality in society? By the way, this is an aside, but Bertolt Brecht was also one of these. Bertolt Brecht was he was among these cast of characters. And Bertolt Brecht wrote the Threepenny Opera, in which one of the songs in the Threepenny Opera was "Mac the Knife," which kind of has a song in American lore. I think Frank Sinatra made it popular, but Bertolt Brecht in the Threepenny Opera was committed to producing theatrical productions that would be subversive of Christian morality by getting people to perform actions in the theater that they might never, or to see things in the theater that they might never perform or never see in their homes or in their own lives. So Wilhelm Reich, he's engaged in these Freudian efforts in the 1930s in Vienna, and you can read this in his diaries, where he basically has a few clients that are coming to him, and he observes something. He observes that inasmuch as they adhere to living Christian morality, they don't give up on God. But then he notices that if they go to something like a play by Bertolt Brecht, if they go to some performance, and in that performance, they can be goaded into seeing or doing something that goes against the 6th or the 9th commandments, that the image of God just dissipates. And so this led to a kind of demonic light to go off, or demonic darkness, right, to go off in the mind of Wilhelm Reich. Reich said that in the new means that we have available to us, the theater, the movie, advertising, television, radio, instruments or mechanisms for enabling the idea of God to dissipate without having to make arguments against the existence of God. By the way, I just want to make a little bit of an aside here, but so often these days we see these polls where people are like, they try to dig into, why are Catholics losing their faith? And so they do these polls, and they discover always these polls and the questions that they ask. People always say, well, I lost my Catholic faith when I was 10 or 11 because of science. And then all sorts of efforts are made to produce videos, institutes, websites, showing that Catholics don't have a problem with science. Well, I beg to differ. I think Wilhelm Reich understood human nature a little bit better than some of these pollsters, right? Because Wilhelm Reich understood, if I just argue with a Catholic girl in Vienna about science and God and the proofs of God's existence and whatnot, she can usually respond to me. I think we Catholics, we have a long history of faith and reason in science and how to deal with these things and the debates that can go on. I think we can distinguish between what's an opinion based on a scientific theory and what is essential to the content of the faith. I don't know anybody, I don't know if you've ever met anybody like who saw a picture of humans walking with dinosaurs, and that led to a crisis of faith that led them to lose their faith. Oh my gosh. Someone out there believes that humans walked with dinosaurs. I can't believe in God anymore. I mean, I don't know many people I don't know anyone. That's absurd. Right? But I do know a lot of people, if you start to ask, maybe for the Wilhelm Reich trajectory, right? Which Wilhelm Reich understood. If you can use the theater, you can use movie, you can use advertising, you can use television. There's all sorts of ways you can use these things to change people's behavior, right? And if you can get people to do something that goes against their values, the image of God will over time dissipate.